What if the INTP's emotional struggle isn't a flaw, but a complex, misunderstood aspect of their brilliance? Prepare to challenge your assumptions about emotional expression. We're exploring the surprising Jungian psychology behind why INTPs often keep their feelings under wraps and what that really means for their inner world. The logic gate, INTP's internal world. Ever felt like your emotions are locked behind a puzzle only you can't solve? That is the quiet paradox of the INTP mind. On the surface, life seems governed by reason, every thought filtered through logic, every experience translated into principles, every question broken into smaller, cleaner questions. But beneath that surface sits a more elusive current, feeling, raw and untamed, asking for expression in a language that reason does not easily speak. The INTP carries what Jung described as dominant introverted thinking. It is a function that craves structure, precision, and clarity. The world is mapped, ideas are sorted, contradictions are tested. This mode of living sharpens the intellect in ways few others can match, but it also has a hidden cost. When logic rules the center stage, emotion waits at the edges, unacknowledged, sometimes unnamed, often misunderstood even by the one who feels it. This wiring explains why INTPs are so often seen as emotionally distant. It is not that they lack depth of feeling, in fact, their emotions are often vast, layered, and intense. But because the inner system is designed to analyze before it expresses, the feeling remains trapped in drafts and revisions, never quite reaching the spoken word. To others, this looks like silence. To the INTP, it feels like standing at the edge of a doorway that cannot be opened from either side. And here lies the struggle. The very gift of analysis that allows INTPs to see hidden truths also keeps them from being seen in their own truth. The logic gate is both protection and prison. Jung's cognitive stacks, unpacking the INTP. But why does this specific internal logic lead to emotional struggles? To really understand this, we need to step back into Jung's map of the mind. He spoke of something he called cognitive functions, the core mental processes that guide how we think, decide, and connect. They're like the gears behind the visible clock face of personality. For an INTP, the dominant gear is T, introverted thinking. This function turns inward. It doesn't chase the crowd's answers or society's definitions. Instead, it tests everything against an inner framework of logic and consistency. If something doesn't fit, the INTP dissects it, refines it, reshapes it. This gives them their brilliance, the ability to cut through illusions, to see truth stripped of pretense. But here is the price: when so much energy is devoted to analysis, something else goes unattended. That something else is extrovert feeling. Jung described it as the mirror of T, but placed in shadow. Is about emotional harmony, about reading the pulse of others, about expressing warmth in a way the outside world can easily receive. For INTPs, this function sits low in the hierarchy, like a muscle that never quite got trained. When they try to use it, it feels unnatural, even awkward. Imagine walking into a room where everyone else is speaking a language you only half know. You understand some words, but not the rhythm, not the nuance. That's how feels for an INTP in moments where emotional connection is expected. They know they care. They know something is stirring inside. But turning that into gestures or words that others can immediately recognize, that feels like grasping at smoke. And this creates a painful paradox. The INTP feels deeply but expresses clumsily. To others, that clumsiness looks like detachment. A partner may think, "You don't care about me," when in truth, the INTP is overwhelmed with care but doesn't have the script to perform it in the usual way. The more this happens, the more misunderstood they feel. The more misunderstood they feel, the deeper they retreat back into analysis, where at least they feel competent and safe. Jung warned of this exact tension: the inferior function doesn't vanish, it hides. And when ignored, it erupts in ways that confuse both self and others. For the INTP, may burst out suddenly, an unexpected wave of emotion, a defensive reaction, or a socially awkward attempt at warmth that feels off. These moments leave them embarrassed, replaying the scene in their head, analyzing every detail to figure out why it went wrong. But the truth is simple: they were trying to use a tool that has always been left in the shadows. This is the heart of the INTP's emotional struggle. Their greatest strength, the dominance of T, also casts their greatest weakness into darkness. Their inner world is brilliant at solving riddles, yet feelings refuse to fit into tidy categories. You cannot measure affection the way you measure logic. You cannot dissect grief the way you dissect an argument. And so, while the INTP seeks mastery, emotion insists on being lived rather than solved. The Fey dilemma: when logic meets feeling. So, what happens when an INTP actually tries to express themselves emotionally? This is where the inner logic gate collides with the rawness of feeling, and the result is rarely smooth. Inside, there is often an immediate conflict. The INTP feels something rising: affection, frustration, longing, but before it can reach the surface, T steps in like a cautious gatekeeper. Wait, what exactly are you feeling? Is it accurate? Is it safe to share? Will it be understood the way you mean it? And in that pause, the emotion is already delayed, filtered, sometimes even smothered. What was meant to be a moment of openness becomes another private puzzle. When emotional vulnerability is required, in relationships, in friendships, in those fragile moments where words matter more than reason, the INTP tends to overthink. They begin analyzing the right way to phrase a feeling instead of simply letting it out. They search for precision, forgetting that feelings are rarely precise. And because perfection seems impossible, silence or withdrawal feels safer. This is why so many INTPs are misunderstood as cold or detached. It's not a lack of care, it's the opposite. They care so much that they fear misrepresenting it. Picture this: someone asks, "Do you love me?" An INTP may hesitate, not because the love isn't there, but because they're sifting through definitions of love, through the sincerity of the word, through whether saying it now will match the depth they actually feel. By the time they're ready, the silence has already spoken, and often, it speaks the wrong story. Other times, they attempt to explain instead of express. A partner might want warmth, but the INTP offers analysis: "I value this relationship because it aligns with what I see as meaningful commitment." That sounds logical, even admirable, but it doesn't land as intended. The heart behind it is real, but the language feels clinical. The emotion remains present but disguised in intellectual clothing. And then there are the moments when the dam breaks. After suppressing and overthinking, the inferior Fey bursts through unfiltered, a sudden emotional outpouring, an awkward attempt at reassurance, or even irritation that doesn't match the situation. These eruptions confuse everyone, including the INTP themselves. Later, they replay it again and again in their head, trying to understand why they couldn't just say the right thing at the right time. This is the dilemma: when logic meets feeling, the two don't blend smoothly for an INTP. One demands structure, the other demands surrender. The thinker inside wants to solve emotion, while the heart simply wants to be felt. The gap between those two states is where the INTP lives, often quietly burdened by the fear that no one will ever truly see what they feel behind the silence. Shadow work and emotional growth for INTPs. It's not all doom and gloom. In fact, understanding this struggle is already the first step toward growth. Jung believed that the very parts of us we neglect, the so-called shadow, are not enemies but teachers. For the INTP, that shadow is often Fey, the function that longs for connection and harmony but has been left underdeveloped. And like all shadows, if ignored, it will find its own way out, sometimes through emotional outbursts, sometimes through passive-aggressive remarks, sometimes through a sudden wave of feeling that seems to come from nowhere. Think of it this way: what you repress doesn't disappear, it waits. The INTP who continually pushes emotion aside may one day find themselves exploding over something trivial, or feeling irrationally hurt by a comment that would normally slide by. This is the shadow's reminder: you cannot reason me away. I demand to be seen. So how can an INTP grow here without betraying who they are? Jung would say the task is not to suppress the shadow nor to let it take over, but to bring it into dialogue. That means learning to engage consciously with Fae, rather than leaving it to burst forth uncontrollably. And this is not about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more whole. Practical steps begin with self-observation. When you feel something, pause before analyzing it. Instead of asking, "What does this mean?" logically, ask, "What is my body telling me right now? Is there tension in the chest? A heaviness in the throat?" These subtle signals are the language of Fae, and simply noticing them begins the process of integration. Journaling can also be powerful for INTPs. But not in the way of analyzing events, rather, naming emotions without judgment. Write a sentence as if you're a witness: "I felt hurt when my idea was dismissed." This small act of naming is a way of pulling the shadow into light, giving form to what would otherwise remain vague and unspoken. Over time, this practice builds the vocabulary of feeling, making expression less foreign. Another Jungian-inspired practice is observing emotions in others. INTPs already have a talent for pattern recognition. Apply that skill to notice how people around you express warmth, disappointment, gratitude, or care. Noticing these micro-expressions is not about imitation but about understanding that emotion is not chaos, it has structure, and it can be learned, just like any other language. And finally, practice conscious, small acts of expression. It doesn't need to be grand or eloquent. A simple, "I appreciate that you did this for me," or "I felt discouraged earlier," is enough. Each act is like training a neglected muscle, awkward at first, but stronger with repetition. This is shadow work in practice, taking what once lived in darkness and letting it stand in the light. The paradox is that by giving Fae a seat at the table, the INTP doesn't lose their sharp mind, they enrich it. They add texture, depth, and a new kind of clarity, the clarity of value, connection, and shared humanity. Embracing the INTP emotional journey. This journey isn't about becoming someone you're not. It's not about forcing yourself into a role that feels foreign or pretending emotions should flow out of you like they do for others. It's about becoming a more complete version of yourself, one where thought and feeling, logic and humanity, sit side by side instead of across a locked gate. Emotional expression is not a weakness, and it is not a betrayal of your nature. It is a skill, like any other, that can be learned, refined, and practiced. For INTPs, the path may be slower, more deliberate, more awkward at times. But every step forward is a piece of shadow integrated, a part of the self reclaimed. And that is not fragility. That is strength. Remember this: your way of being has its own value. The world is often flooded with noise, with shallow words spoken too quickly. Your careful hesitation, your quiet struggle to find accuracy in what you feel, that itself is a form of honesty. It may not look like the typical script of emotion, but it carries its own integrity. People who truly know you recognize that when you do speak your feelings, it comes from a place of sincerity that cannot be faked. So accept that your emotional landscape is different, not deficient. See it as a frontier for exploration rather than a verdict of limitation. The thinker in you remains brilliant. The feeler in you, though less practiced, is no less real. Together, they form a whole that is rare, a mind that questions deeply, and a heart that, once it learns to speak, does so with depth few can match. That is the gift of the INTP. Not to become someone else's idea of emotional, but to bring your unique rhythm into the symphony of human connection. Keep exploring it. Keep understanding it. And most of all, keep allowing yourself to grow into the fullness of who you already are.